Greetings, everyone. This is Richard Solomon, Taking Care of Business. We have an incredibly important and moving show this week. We are with BBC journalist and author Dina Gold, who has written an incredible book called Stolen Legacy. Stolen Legacy is a story of both tenacity, justice, perseverance, and it took over 150 years to accumulate all this information. I'm going to let Dina talk about the book. Dina, your family lived in Germany since when?
Since around the mid-1700s. I have a family tree which traces them back that far.
All right. And I assume they were well entrenched in German society for the 200 years or so that they lived here. What did they do?
Well, in the 1700s, I'm not altogether sure, but I can tell you what my great-great-grandfather did, and he seems to have been completely integrated into German society. He established himself as a fur trader. He has set up a fur company dealing in pelts. And he seems to have been quite successful, but then his son, my great-grandfather, was much, much more successful. And he turned this company into an international, highly, highly profitable fur company.
So they had the entrepreneurial spirit.
Oh, yes.
What was special about them? My ancestry happens to be Greek, and I know that there were a lot of Greeks who were also in the fur trade. In fact, in New York City in the 20s, the streets that were from the 20 to 29th, and the garment district was known as the Furrier District because at that time in the 70s there were plenty of fur traders who had all kinds of minks and coats and things like that in the windows. So how did they get involved in what was their niche in the market? Well,
they seem to have had the whole range of furs. So they had mink and ermine and all the way down to rabbit furs. And my great-grandfather came up with some very clever invention that he dyed the rabbit furs to make them look like very expensive mink and sable and so on, so that he could sell coats that looked as if they were expensive, but in fact they were made of very cheap furs. And that apparently was a great hit.
And I assume that helped the dating, the men in the dating world.
Probably, yes.
So wait, your great grandfather, the super entrepreneur, that was yes. Hyman?
No, that was Hyman's son, Victor, my great grandfather.
Okay, so yes. Now you actually have a picture of Hyman
yes.
in your book, and where did you get a picture of someone so old, especially given the fact that many records were lost during the World War II era?
Oh, you'd be surprised. They were not lost. And that's what I discovered when I came to do the research for this claim that we're talking about. But my mother actually had a photo album, and I just went through it, and there he was. So I've got photographs of my great-grandfather and of his wife,
Joanna.
And then of my great-grandfather. Oh, yes, going back a long, long way. Yeah, right. Incredible what you can find.
Wow. So Victor
yes.
is the major dude,
yes.
and Lucy's his wife.
Yes.
Okay, so they're so successful that they purchased some property and moved their headquarters, right?
What happened? Well, they lived on a grand estate by the Wannsee Lake. In fact, just down the road to where the Wannsee Conference was held. But Victor was so successful that he bought some land in central Berlin. I've only discovered that recently. I didn't know all of this. And he had a very famous architect build a headquarters for this fur company. And it's a 6-story high building stretching back a whole block. And that's where the headquarters were, where the furs were kept, where he had designers, fashions made up. That was his headquarters for this international business.
Okay, and this was in Krausenstrasse?
Yes, in Krausenstrasse, in Krausenstrasse in the Mitte district, which is the heart of the Jewish textiles and fashion industry.
Oh, so this was like a whole garment center.
Sure. That's where all the Jews were, yeah.
Okay. What, was there a synagogue nearby?
I think there probably was. They belonged to Fasanenstrasse synagogue, very famous one. Right. Where at one point Leo Beck was the rabbi.
Wow, that's pretty wild.
Yeah.
So you have all this great information, historically, but let's fast forward. There's a moment where you learn that your legacy, your family's heritage and property were all stolen from you, and you decide to do something about it. So I want to go to that moment where the lightning kind of hits you, and you kind of jump into action, and you're like, we or I have got to do something about this.
Okay,
I want to hear about that because that's critical. And then I want to go back and.
As you can hear from my accent, I am English. And I grew up in London, and my grandmother used to take me out for coffee and cakes and trips to the museums and the ballet, and she didn't have a bean. She really had no money. But she used to regale me with the wonderful life that she used to live in Berlin before the Second World War, when she lived on this grand estate with her husband, my grandfather, and they had nannies and they had chauffeur-driven Mercedes and gardeners and cooks and all the rest of it. Anyway, they lost the lot. And she used to tell me, when the Berlin Wall comes down, we'll be rich. We'll get back the building that the family owned. Well, of course, I didn't know what she was talking about. I hadn't got a clue, but she'd tell me all these wonderful stories. And as you can imagine, all little girls think that they're really princesses. And all these stories would fill my head. And I think, oh, well, maybe she's right, maybe she isn't. But my mother would say, forget it. She's a fantasist. I don't know what she's talking about. Yes, there was a building, but perhaps we rented it. Perhaps the family didn't own it. Maybe she's making it up. I don't know if there's truth to any of this. But anyway, you can't get your hands on it because it is behind the Berlin Wall. It's in what is now East Berlin. Well, when I was growing up, of course, that was the Soviet sector. You couldn't get a claim going on any property on the eastern side of the Berlin Wall. So I just put it out of my mind. And my grandmother died in 1977, and she left no documents, no photographs, not even an address of this mythical building.
Wow, so you had very little to go on.
I had nothing, literally nothing.
You had a story. You had Bubba
I had these dreams, these fantasies, these memories of my grandmother, which my mother dismissed. So I put it out of my mind. But then in 1989, the Berlin Wall came down because it was the end of communism. And I thought back to these stories, and I said to my husband, do you know, my grandmother used to tell me these stories. Do you think there's any truth in it? And he said, well, I don't know. Maybe you should look into it. And that's when the hunt started.
Well, you're an investigative journalist. So so you actually had tools
I was lucky.
To draw upon. So what were the tools that you drew upon?
Well, I had to find some documents to see if there was any truth in any of this. And I happened to be very lucky. At that point, I was working for the BBC, as you know, and I was assigned to cover the combined German elections. So I went to Bonn, and I met there a researcher, and I told him this story, and I said, see if you can find anything. And he found an old 1920s business directory, the equivalent of the Yellow Pages, and in it there was an advert for something called H. Wolf. Now, H. Wolf was the name of my grandfather, Herbert Wolf, and there was an address, Krausenstrasse. So I thought this looked pretty likely. So after the elections, I flew to Berlin, and I got in a taxi, and I gave the address, and I turned up at the building. So that was the first time I saw it.
So I got to ask you, when you were in Germany, as a person whose ancestry was brutalized by the German government in the World War II era, how did it feel to actually be on German soil?
Weird.
Right? Was it a little creepy?
Uncomfortable. I have mixed feelings. The young people I found were very helpful and friendly, but I always felt a bit queasy when I was with anybody who might have been around during the Hitler years.
Right, because these are the people who may have been responsible for the death and destruction of your family.
Yes.
Directly or indirectly.
Yeah.
So did that creepy feeling propel you into more tenacity, or did it kind of subdue you into like, this is going to be a little uncomfortable?
No, I felt very much the weight of the history and of my heritage and of the stories that I'd heard. And I did have this one piece of paper, which was a photocopy of this advert, and I thought, I found this building, I better go in. What can they do to me? They can throw me out for trespassing, they can call the police, or they can talk to me. So I marched in, and I said, I want to talk to the most senior person here. And the manager was called, and I said to him, I've come to claim my family's building. And he laughed at me. But he didn't laugh for very long, because I pulled out of my pocket this advert, and I said, H. Wolf, that was my grandfather, and I think he owned this building. And this man sort of paled, and he said, you'd better come in. And he took me into the canteen and left me there for 20 minutes while he went to phone head office, because he didn't know what it was all about. And when he came back, he said, you're right. They've been waiting for this to happen, but they didn't know if anybody had survived the war. Tell me your story.
Okay, so what was the story that you told?
The story I told him was that my grandfather, Herbert, and his wife, Nellie, my grandmother, had lived in Wannsee, that they'd had this magnificent fur company, that I had been told that this was the building that it was in, but that almost as soon as Hitler came to power, my grandfather saw the writing on the wall, and he said, I'm not raising my children here, we're getting out. And he could have gone to London or New York, where he had many, many contacts, but he suddenly found his Zionist heart, and he said, I'm going to Palestine. So off they went. So they survived. This man said to me, well, tell me everything. So I told him that my mother had been sent to school in England at the age of 14 on her own, and that she still lived in London, that she'd met somebody and married him after the war, and I was the daughter. And he at the end of all of this, he said, well, you need to get this building back for your mother. And I said, Ben, I have to confess, actually, I've got no proof. I can't prove that we ever owned it. And he said to me something which was very brave, I think, for an East German bureaucrat. He said, the documents exist. You need to go out there and find them.
Wow. Now, at that moment in time, who owned the building?
Well, who owned it legally at that point?
Well, who was the title holder at the time?
At that point, I discovered all sorts of very interesting things. It was at that point the Ministry of Transport for Germany. And in fact, the minister was moving from his offices in Bonn to the new Ministry of Transport in Berlin, and he had his office in the building. Now, what I discovered after many, many months of digging around in land registries was that what had happened to the building was that it had been seized in 1937. It had been foreclosed on. It had a mortgage which was being serviced, but it was seized and handed directly to the Reichsbahn, to Hitler's railways.
So was it a fake foreclosure or a manufactured foreclosure?
Manufactured foreclosure.
Okay, so the people need to know that. So your family was paying the bills and everything was cool. It's just that the people in power decided that, Jewish property needed to be taken by some form, so they used the legal system to take it from them.
They used the courts to get hold of it. What had happened was that the building next door, number 1920, the owners had reneged on their mortgage. They couldn't pay it, so they had been foreclosed on in a perfectly legal fashion a few months beforehand. And the Reichsbahn had therefore got hold of that building immediately, and they wanted the one next door, so it served them very well that this happened to be a Jewish family. And by 1937, what rights did Jews have?
Well, was the foreclosure of the other people caused by the boycott of Jewish businesses, which in a sense...
No, the other people were not Jews.
Oh, okay.
And let me tell you something really shocking. This was... they got 40% more for their building than my family got for theirs.
Wow.
Yeah.
All right, we're going to have to talk about that right after the break. This is Richard Solomon with Dina Gold, the author of Stolen Legacy. Keep it right here. We'll be right back at Taking Care of Business on WCWP. All right, welcome back. This is Richard Solomon, Taking Care of Business, and we are discussing Stolen Legacy, the very important historical work of Dina Gold, who is a BBC journalist who fought for her family's legacy in that the Nazi government during the World War II era seized a building that was owned, and the business, obviously, by her family, and her quest, her tenacity to get what was really rightfully hers back. Both on behalf of, I guess, the Jewish people, her family, and for herself. All right, so let's go back because we were talking sort of during the break, and one thing that really hit me very hard was on your website. There is some old film of your ancestors as little people running around and having fun, and you just feel, and you know, so it's one of these. It's a silent movie, and it's one of these like classic old pieces of film that is very cherished. And what's disturbing is that I know that those little children who are having just glorious fun are about to have their lives ripped from them, and they don't know it. And their whole world and the world for many little children is about to drastically change. How did you come about finding that film, and what does that film mean to you and to your whole family?
Well, it's very sweet, isn't it? It's my mother and her younger brother and sister running around in the gardens on the estate in Wannsee, watched over by their grandmother, Lucy, and an English nanny. And we found an old tin. I don't know how it got saved, but it said on it film, so I took it to some transfer facility, and I asked them if they could have a look at it, and they said, yeah, it is 1920s black and white silent film, and we'll transfer it for you. So that's what I had done. In fact, I've got about 20 minutes worth of this kind of material of my grandfather on holiday, and lots of lovely scenes. I mean, these people were quite wealthy, and they obviously in those days they had a cine camera, and they went around filming themselves.
Wow. That's pretty wild. So let's go back. So now you're in the building on Krausenstrasse Street, and you're learning about your legacy. Now, do you read or speak any German?
Minimal.
Okay, so you probably needed help in the physical research and deciphering where documents are and how to read them, especially technical documents. Yes. Now, what I learned from your book is that the Germans, what I learned from your book is that the stereotype that the Germans kept great records was true in this case. That there were lots of records.
Absolutely true, staggeringly so.
So what was the records that you needed to unearth? How did you find them? Where were they? And then how did you get what you call certified copies of all this stuff?
Luck, hard work, digging around. I had to prove, in order to launch a claim, you have to prove various things. You have to prove that you owned the building. You have to prove the line of inheritance, so you have to get an inheritance certificate. And we had to prove also that the building had been seized. It was under duress. It was a Nazi-driven seizure. So obviously, there was a lot to prove. I tried to get hold of land registry documents, and ordinary people, as opposed to attorneys, were not allowed in those days into the land registry. But I heard that an East German lawyer had managed to get hold of a notarized copy of the land registry documents. So my husband and I leapt into a taxi, shot across East Berlin into some very, very dingy housing estate, and we found this apartment of the lawyer, and we knocked on his door, and we said what we wanted, and he looked completely nonplussed, clearly saw us as desperate for this thing, and said, well, you'll have to pay for it. So we said, how much? And he said, 300 Deutschmarks, which was about $200. So we paid him immediately and got out. And that document was vital, and it proved who had owned the building, and it was indeed the Wolf family. So it was a major, major find. And it proved what had happened, that it had been taken off the family and handed directly to the Reichsbahn. And it has a purple stamp on the document, which means it's notarized, and it will stand up in a court of law. And we found that the Soviet authorities that had taken over East Berlin had been very honorable. They had gone around the buildings and tried to ascertain, immediately after the end of the war, who had owned which building. And they had put something in the land registry attached to the land registry document saying, this building can be used, it's not to be sold, it was taken from its previous Jewish owners, and until its provenance is sorted out, it is not to be on-sold, which was brilliant for us.
Right. Now, was that writing in Russian, or was it in German?
No, it was in German.
Oh, interesting.
Yeah, I have it. I have that document.
Wow.
Yeah. And we had to find birth certificates, death certificates, marriage certificates, wills to prove that my mother was a legal inheritor. Incredibly, are all in various archives. The Germans hold on to everything. Absolutely incredible. I don't think it would be the case if we'd been claiming in the rest of Eastern Europe. Can you imagine trying to do this in Poland or Hungary or Lithuania? I don't think I'd have found much. But in Germany, they are punctilious to a degree.
But how did the records actually survive saturation bombings?
Yeah.
I mean, if you watch the History Channel,
I know
you really see Dresden was decimated.
Yeah.
Berlin, my
flattened.
My father served in the United States Army post-war, and he was part of the United States occupation force between 48 and 51. And, he tells me stories of what Germany was like, when he was in the Army's transport division. And he said that the place was flattened.
Yes.
So how did the documents actually survive? Were they off-site? Were they just underground?
I don't know that. It must have been just pure luck. My father was in the RAF, and he kept saying to me, you're not going to find anything, and the place was flattened.
Because he was part of the flattening crowd.
There it was. They're there. You can find them.
Wow.
Yeah. Just luck. Yeah. Maybe they weren't aiming at the town halls or the repositories where these documents were stored, but they're there.
All right. So for all those people who are listening to us talk about this, how did you commence a legal action? What was the mechanism for filing the claim? Did you hire lawyers? Did you bring a lawsuit? How did that come about?
Okay. I knew that I could go running around and finding documents, but I'm not a lawyer. I knew we had to get lawyers. So in London, I found a firm of lawyers who were in fact were qualified to practice law either in Germany or London, both. And I persuaded my mother to go along and to meet them. And they said, well, there's a lot to prove, but you need to register a claim. This was absolutely vital. The Germans, after the wall fell down, they had about a 2-year window of opportunity where if you wanted to file a claim, you had to register a claim. Otherwise, there was a severe risk of losing out. So my mother agreed that these lawyers, who she gave power of attorney to act on her behalf, could file a claim. Now, she was petrified of the likely cost of all of this because lawyers can be very pricey. And I said, well, I'll do the work, and they can dress it up in legal language. And in fact, we were lucky. These lawyers did it on a contingency basis, so no win, no fee. but they could see that from the photographs that I'd taken of this building, this was a huge building, and that if they could win, they would get a hefty fee.
Okay, so the litigant was your mom.
Yes.
She is what they say is she was the plaintiff, the claimant.
Yes.
And where did she file the claim? Was it in a court? Was it administrative? How did it work? What was the mechanism?
Well, that was mostly in the hands of the lawyers, but they filed it. There was an office for dealing with Jewish claims, and they filed it there.
Okay.
Now, it could have gone to court. Basically, it was an administrative process. And if the German bureaucrats, civil servants, could see that this was a winning case, they had the power to decide that, yes, they're not going to contest it in court. At one point, it did look as if we were heading to court because they were fighting us. But every time I dug up more information, and in the end, they just threw up their hands and said, okay.
Well, see,
okay.
that's what I read throughout the book, was that tenacity was really important to the process.
Yeah.
That all of the obstacles, both of time, memory loss, record retrieval, language, everything. You had to be so persistent.
Yeah, my mother, you see, I think, my mother was by that point in her late 70s, and she was saying, I haven't got the strength for this. And I think in many cases, who's got the strength to go ahead with this? And they hope that you'll just give up. Well, I was not going to give up. There was no way. And my mother kept saying to me, they're going to prevaricate and hope that I die and that the claim dies with me. And with that in mind, she wrote a codicil to her will saying, if I die, I want the claim to continue and my daughter will handle it. She was determined at that point that after being messed around. But in the end, she lived to see what the outcome.
In Hebrew, there's a word, yasha koach, means like extra strength. Where did your yasha koach come from to keep going, to not stumble, to not, litigation fatigue is something I see as a lawyer.
Yeah.
The parties get between the bills and the
worn
time
out,
and
yeah.
the emotional drain and the worry and the sleepless nights and the opportunity to do something else, sort of like the time cost, is wearing. What kept you in the game? What kept you in the fight?
All sorts of things. You have the burden of history on your shoulders if you're going to take this on. And I felt that very strongly. And I was absolutely not going to let them get away with it. Come hell or high water, I was not. Why should we give up? And I'd been doing investigative journalism for many, many years, so I was quite used to long, hard battles. And as a journalist, this kind of thing is fun, isn't it? You always want a good story, and how much bigger a story was I likely to get? So I also quite enjoyed it.
Did you do this for yourself? Did you do it for your family? Did you do it for the Jewish people? Did you do it for the victims, or did you do it for everybody?
I think I did it for everybody. I mean, it encompasses so many people. It is history, and it is, two fingers to you, if you know the expression. We are still here.
That's
right.
We
are still here.
So, from a legal point of view, did the opposition worry about multiple claims from your side? Because let's put it this way. When you look at the family tree, if you can go back as far as you did, which is the 1700s, and you go forward, and then you see all the branches that go from that, there's, I guess, cousins and, all kinds of stuff. How did they know that settling with you was a full and complete settlement, that they wouldn't have to worry about another claim from another member of your family?
Okay, well, that's very easy to answer. The Germans are very, very particular and very careful. And that is why I have had to supply them with every birth, marriage, death certificate, and will of anybody that might be a claimant. And I did, because I found all these wills, and the pertinent one was the one of Lucy Wolfe, because the building had been in her name until she died, and then she left it very specifically to certain people, and I could show the line of inheritance. And after that, there was nothing for them to worry about. There couldn't be other claimants. It was absolutely tied up.
Were there moments when you had despair and you were like, and how did you hop over that?
Sometimes I got pretty enervated and I thought, well, what is the next hurdle? I mean, for example, at one point they asked us for a death certificate for my mother's uncle, who had been an inheritor of this building. Now, my mother's uncle, I found a transport list with his name on it and the correct date of birth. He was taken at the age of 52 in 1943 to Auschwitz. Who was issuing death certificates in Auschwitz? I mean, what a nerve to ask for us to supply a death certificate. It was ridiculous. So I just thought, this is beyond the pale. I can't give up if they're going to be like that. No, I mean, I have a spine made of steel, I think. I wasn't going to crumble. I just wouldn't do that.
Now, you did all of this. Well, the process started way before the internet, way before social media.
1989, yeah.
Right, well, that's before the internet, social media.
Yes.
Handheld portable phones, searchable databases where you could. Was all your research the old-fashioned, on your feet, dusty card indexes, archives, in basements, like that kind of thing?
There was quite a lot of that, and writing letters. Yes, writing a lot of letters to German archives. The old-fashioned way. Yeah, roll up your shirt sleeves and get on with it.
When did you feel in the process as if before you had the final results that you did, when did you feel like you were turning the corner and you were beginning to see the momentum carrying you forward?
I think at the point when the German embassy in London issued my mother with a certificate of inheritance.
Okay.
That was big. That showed that they recognized that she was an inheritor legally, and that things were starting to fall into place. Yeah.
During this entire process, did you keep a diary or make any documentary of yourself?
Not really, but I did use the press to put pressure on the Germans. And so I've got, the BBC did a radio documentary, and they did a co-production with Mitteldeutscher Rundfunk, which was broadcast in German. So the BBC did one in English, and I'm on that. And the one in Germany, only my mother, because she spoke faultless German. And I got articles in the newspapers and magazines, the Jewish Chronicle, the Evening Standard. I was generating some publicity which did not go down well at all with the civil servants. And in fact, the Germans told our lawyers to tell us to stop it.
Well, there's one way to stop it, which is to settle.
Yes. Yeah. So I do have all of that material, but no, I didn't keep a diary. I was working full time. This was like a hobby. This was a sideshow. And I had 3 children, one of whom was born just as the wall fell down, and another one was born 3 years later. So I had 3 very young children on top of all of this work to do.
Did they know what you were doing?
Yes. They've lived with this all their lives, yeah.
Now that they're older, what do they carry from that within themselves?
I think they find it very interesting. They certainly feel their heritage, their history. It means a lot to them. My mother's uncle Fritz, who was murdered in Auschwitz because he refused to leave Germany. He said, "This madness will pass." How naive is just incredible. So my youngest child, his middle name is Frederick, after Fritz. And yeah, they feel it very strongly.
The illusion of safety. How did that work against those who stayed, and who else was smart enough to leave before the fury?
From my family, I'm afraid none of them. No, just my mother's parents and with their 3 children. All the rest stayed.
Wow.
Yeah.
So that did anyone survive the war?
In Germany, no.
Wow.
No. And on my father's side, who were all from Poland, no. No.
Oh,
No. That's another story. But no, the ones that stayed, no, they didn't. No.
There's a book about the Greek-Jewish experience in the Holocaust called "The Illusion of Safety," and it's the same thing. In World War II, when the Italians occupied Greece, things were fairly okay for the Jewish people because the Italians were not so much interested in the extermination of the Jewish people. But when the Germans came in 1943, everything changed. All right, this is Richard Solomon. We are talking with author and BBC journalist Dina Gold. We will be right back. Please keep it right here. All right, welcome back. This is Richard Solomon with my very, very special guest, Dina Gold, who is the author of Stolen Legacy. One of the interesting things about this book, and there are many, many interesting things, is that this is one of the few stories about property that was not personal property, but real property. Could you talk a little bit about that?
Yes. When I started hunting around for the documents, I wondered if anybody had ever written a book about getting back a building as opposed to art, and I couldn't find any books on this subject. And then I came to Washington in 2008 from London, and I happened to meet Ambassador Stuart Eisenstadt, who was President Clinton's emissary on Holocaust issues to Europe. And I asked him if he knew of any books on getting back a building. And he said no. To the best of his knowledge, that no one had ever written a book about this. He knows of plenty about art, but not about buildings. And he said, go away and write it. And that's what prompted me to sit down and write. So it is a fairly unusual story.
Where the story has, even though the book has a concluding set of pages, the story has not ended.
Indeed, it has not. No, there are still a few battles to fight, I'm afraid.
What can you share with us about ongoing events in 2016? Before
this book went to the publishers, I wrote to the then Minister of Transport for Germany, and I said that I was the granddaughter of somebody who'd once owned this building, and I knew what had happened, and I told him the story, and I said, could I please have a plaque put up on the outside of the building telling its story, so that everybody should know the history of this building. And I got an email back from the minister's office saying, yes, he is aware of the history of this building, and indeed a plaque could be placed on the outside wall so that anybody walking past could read about it. Well, guess what? I'm still waiting. Nothing's happened. So I'm not going to go away because I think if I'm promised something, it should be delivered.
Now, there is a Jewish museum in Berlin, is there not?
There is.
Is your story in that museum?
No one from Berlin has contacted me.
Well,
no.
That's another thing that should probably be remedied.
Yeah.
Shouldn't your books be and maybe the recording of this interview?
Indeed. Well, if you can facilitate that, then fine. But no, there hasn't been much interest from Germany, really.
And yet there is a museum that at least supposedly speaks of the Holocaust. And I've seen only some pictures of it. I don't really know too much about it, to be honest. But
yes, there are many, many memorials and museums in Berlin about the Holocaust and their dreadful history. But no one's been in touch with me.
Well, we may have to change that.
Yep. And I have been in liaison also with the insurance company that foreclosed on my family's building. They still exist. It's the Victoria Insurance Company, and I put all this history to them. I don't think they're best pleased with me, but so be it. And interestingly, I did discover in the course of my research that the chairman of the Victoria Insurance Company, before, during, and after the war, has got a foundation named in his honor at Mannheim University. Now, that might seem perfectly reasonable to you, but I also discovered some fairly choice things about this particular individual. He was head of a consortium of insurance companies that insured the buildings at Auschwitz.
They needed insurance?
They did, yes. A very eminent historian, Professor Gerald Feldman wrote a book on the Allianz Insurance Company and their history. And I got that book and I read it, and lo and behold, I discovered that the Victoria Insurance Company was part of that consortium.
Wow.
It was considered a state secret during the war that the buildings were insured. So I'm
a little flabbergasted. I'm amazed that they actually did that, because they were.
People are amazed.
Wow, I'm actually a little stunned by that. It's hard to believe that those buildings were actually insured, and I'm not even sure what they were insured for.
Fire.
Well, considering they had a crematoria, maybe that sort of makes bizarre sense. But I had relatives who were murdered there. I don't say lost; I actually say murdered, because that's what happened. And the words lost or killed. No, they were murdered. They were brutalized and then murdered. Many of the Greek Jews of my ancestors were marched to their deaths in these camps.
Yeah, but when we think about all of this, I always remember that the Holocaust was a genocide. And, okay, my family lost a building, but so what? People lost their entire families. And nothing that we went through compares with that.
But you did lose a number of relatives.
Yes, we did. But the book that I wrote about getting the building back, it was an adventure, and it was interesting, and I can prove how many documents you can find. But when I compare it to the genocide, you can't compare it, can you?
No. Well, the tragedy of the Holocaust is there were losses both tangible and intangible, and as we've sort of spoke both before the interview and during the breaks, there was intellectual property, ideas, innovations, all
patents,
lost.
Trademarks, companies. Yes.
Think if Albert Einstein didn't get out, how the world would be different.
Yeah. There are estimates that total losses, if you include everything, is $200 billion worth. If you look at all the things that Jews own, not only material things, but their trademarks and their inventions and the goodwill that they had for their companies, all of that, it's just all been lost, stolen, taken.
I did not know until I read your book that there was an actual textile industry in Germany, because I really thought that in Europe that was more of the province of Britain. No.
The Berlin fashion industry was thriving. It was booming and hugely dominated by Jewish designers, fashion owners, companies. Hugely. And now they're trying to revive it, but they forget why they need to revive it.
Why do they need to revive it?
Because they killed the Jews that were running the fashion business, or the Jews fled.
Well, your mom, was she a fashion person?
Oh, no, she was 14 when when she left Germany, she was an 11-year-old child. When she went to England, she was 14, and she never had any money.
No, but did she have a sense of fashion?
I would say, yes, she did.
Right.
But the one who really had a sense of fashion was my grandmother. My grandmother, Nellie, was like a model. She had such flair and style. She was like a model out of Vogue. So she always lived that dream.
I saw a picture in the book. There are some graves of your ancestors in Germany. Did you have a chance to go visit them?
Yes, I have.
Where are they interned, and what was the cemetery desecrated?
Weissensee, which was the big Jewish cemetery just outside Berlin. And I turned up there in about 1992, and I walked through the front gate, and I went into a little office, and I said I was looking for the grave of my great-grandmother and my great-grandfather. And they asked me the name, and I gave it, and this lady flicked through a little card index. There was nothing computerized then. And she said, "Oh, yes, here it is." And she got out a little map, and she put a ring around the grave, and it was just walk down this path, and it's on the eastern wall. And I found this huge mausoleum where the family was all buried, and it was untouched, unscathed. The Nazis just didn't touch it.
Wow. That's kind of surprising, considering the desecration of many of the graves.
Not in Weissensee. They left it intact.
Your mom saw victory.
Yes.
As a daughter. What did that mean to you? And as someone who had the information, what was it? What was it for her to see something very important concluded in her lifetime?
She was very quietly triumphant, I would say. She didn't tell her friends too much about it, but she was gratified that it had been done. She felt that justice had been done, and she wanted it to be seen to be done. And I think she was satisfied that I had pursued it, even though she had tried to persuade me not to. I think she was very pleased. And the money did make her life more comfortable. She had always had a complete dread of going into an old age home. She just did not want to do that. She wanted to remain in her own home, and this money allowed her to do that because she could have a carer come in. I don't think she could have done that if we hadn't won this money. So it made her life more comfortable. And for that, I'm grateful.
How satisfying was it for you?
Immensely.
To do this for your mom?
Yes. I was really pleased that I could do it for her. Yeah.
Did she ever say anything privately to you like, wow,
yes.
that was...
Yeah. She said, I couldn't have done it without you.
Wow.
And in fact, I have footage of her because I filmed her. I interviewed her with a BBC crew, and I have the footage.
I saw that. I actually saw.
Yeah, and there are 3 or 4 clips on my website
Right.
that I put up of her talking about life. But in fact, I have about 2.5 days worth of this. And some of it is with her and me sitting together talking about it. And she says, I couldn't have done it without you. And Dad always said, this is nonsense. You can't take on a government and win. Who do you think you are? And she said, it was amazing that you did it. Yeah, she was pretty thrilled.
Is there a larger message for people out there who are still fighting, who are still trying to reclaim their stolen legacy?
I would say good luck. I'm with you all the way. Go for it. But it's going to be a long, hard struggle. What is
the hardest part? Is it that time is our enemy?
Yes.
At this point?
Yeah, I think it is. Governments would like to say there's a time limit, and you've missed the deadline. Now, the whole of Eastern Europe is yet to be sorted out. Some government, all the laws are different depending on which country you go to. So, in one country, you'll find it's easier than in others. But how on earth are people going to find documents when they've all been destroyed after all these years? It's over 70 years, and it's, how many records are you going to find? It's hard.
How was the transition of Europe to the EU a factor in what your quest was about?
I don't think the EU had anything to do with it. I think once the Berlin Wall fell and the East German state was no longer, that was that was crucial actually, because I couldn't have claimed before that happened.
Now the property was like what, 1 or 2 blocks?
Yeah, it's 2 blocks from Checkpoint Charlie. So you go to Checkpoint Charlie and it's literally 2 blocks. Wow. So if you'd stood on the roof, you could have looked over into West Berlin when the wall was there. It was literally, a few hundred yards from the wall.
Did anyone ever try to tunnel from there or anything like that, or any great stories?
Yeah, when you go there, and I was there last June. I have photographs of me standing outside the building last June. There are all sorts of markers very close to that where people were shot trying to get over into the West. That's where the guard posts were, and the East German soldiers would shoot them.
When you're in the building now, do you ever talk to your ancestors? Do you ever say, "Hey, look what we did," Or
in my head, maybe. But I tell you what's really sweet. Well, you can see it on my website. There's an archway. There's a photograph taken in 1910 of the building, both the front and the back. And at the back, there's a beautiful archway with 3 little carvings over it. And when I was there in June, I took a picture of myself standing exactly by that archway. And those 3 little carvings are unchanged, undamaged. Now, when you think about it, they have survived through 2 world wars and communism, and the little carvings are identical. They have not been damaged. So this building has really seen some history. If that building could talk, eh?
Well, I think there's a picture of that. Isn't there a picture of that in your book? Yeah,
Not
there's a picture.
No, I don't think there is.
I see. There's a picture.
It's on the website.
Okay, I remember I saying. Well, by the way, for the people listening, what is your website address and what is the social media that they can look at?
www.stolenlegacy.com.
Right.
And on Twitter, I'm at Dina_Gold.
Okay, and then Facebook.
It's Stolen Legacy Berlin.
Okay. Now, for people out there, the actual title of the book is Stolen Legacy, Nazi Theft and the Quest for Justice at Krausenstrasse 17/18 Berlin. And it was published by a subdivision of the American Bar Association.
Yes.
Which is actually very interesting.
Yes.
That lawyers would actually be involved in a pursuit of justice, which is good, which is actually good. The actual, what is, I forgot, who is the public?
Ankerwick. The American Bar Association set up just over a year ago a new imprint called Ankerwick. The Ankerwick tree is at the site where the Magna Carta was signed. Bet you didn't know that.
I didn't know that at all. Wow.
Well, that's what it is. If you look up Ankerwick, it's a very famous yew tree at the site in Runnymede. And this is an imprint of books with a legal theme, but for the ordinary reader, it's not, heavy tomes on tort law. It's all sorts of interesting stories. So they've got, they've reissued the Perry Mason series, all sorts of exciting, there's novels, there's real life stories like mine. Yeah, it's a whole range of new books.
What I loved about the book was how easy it was to read, how thorough it was, and how captivating it was. It really moved you along. And what I really loved more than anything else, I think, was just the pictures, because the pictures really show the people, the humanity behind all of this. It's not just a building. This is a story about a family. And what they went through, and truly a legacy. It's great to see pictures of people who, I guess the oldest pictures it's got to go into is it the 1800s?
Probably, yeah. It would be, yes. Well, apparently there's going to be a paperback. They want me to update it because there's quite a lot of updating to be done, and I'm going to put new pictures in. I forgot that I actually have a picture of myself standing outside the building with my little red duffel coat on, next to the plaques. As I found the building when I first turned up in 1990, I'd forgotten I had it, so it isn't in this book, but the paperback will have it. And we'll put in some new photos and update the story because there's quite a lot going on still.
Wow. It is an incredible story. I am honored to have been able to talk to you about this and to share the story of your family. It's been
lovely to join you.
So I appreciate your time. Keep fighting the good fight. And truly, when I have clients who are suffering from litigation fatigue, I'm actually going to give them a copy of the book and say, this is what tenacity will yield. This is what a fight for justice truly boils down to. You need to read this and get inspired and then get back into, the litigation, because you can't let the roadblocks, the setbacks, defeat you, because that greater than the death of your body is the death of hope. And I think that's what World War II, that they tried to do to the Jewish people, is to break our hope. And your story is sort of the resurrection of hope, and I think that's the greatest part of your book.
Thank you.
All right. Thank you so much for being with us. This is Richard Solomon. Thanks for being part of our radio family, and we'll see you next week. Until then, thanks for listening.